watching on mine, though. If you're watching on Facebook, feel free to go to the centralreform.org website, and you can join the Zoom conversation there just by clicking on it. And now we should be live on the other places too.
I do have one more question.
Yeah.
So when I went to school and in my Judaic studies classes, we talked a lot about like the, pre-Great Revolt Sadducees and the Pharisees as like a grassroots movement in response to the Sadducees and all that stuff. Was there still like a significant Sadducee following after the Great Revolt? I mean, because when I think about some of the things that have been
when you say the Great Revolt, are you talking about 70 and what leads to the destruction of the temple? Okay.
Yeah. Bar Kokhba.
So that plus the 130s, got it. So that whole time period, got it.
Yeah.
Keep going with your question. I'm sorry.
I was just wondering because it seems really like it's intense. The stuff they wrote about the Sadducees is just blistering. And I was wondering, did they kind of like, because we see the power structure change, like you're saying, in real time. Was that kind of like indicative of the myth being created of this sort of pharisaical mainstream approach to Judaism?
Yeah. Okay. Let me take much of this apart. Just show of hands, who's heard the phrases Pharisees and Sadducees? So, sort of, most of us have. Okay. So our main sources of information on this, and I should say, by the way, some of my knowledge on this might very well be dated by this point too. This stuff changes pretty quickly. The main sources of knowledge that we have about this time period in the groups tend to be Josephus, who writes a history for the Romans. He's rather unreliable. We get some other sources as well, but then we also get the rabbis and the Talmud itself talking about this time period. And we also get the Dead Sea Scrolls, another important sort of body of work from roughly around this time period. Broadly, what has happened, I would say, Sarah, over the last 15 years or so, as I understand it in academic research, has been that people have stopped believing the rabbinic sources to be as true as they used to be, and have begun to understand them as much more polemical than they had been. This still tends to be truer of American research than Israeli research on the question, which still wants to hold the Talmud up a little more in terms of its historicity for obvious reasons. Did that address your question?
Kind of. I guess I was curious about, I feel like in the Talmud, you can definitely see their biases, but I was curious if there was still a significant movement of people who followed sort of the more traditional. Got it.
Yeah. So we certainly find, even by the time you get to the year 1000, you find the Jewish world divided up into rabbinic Jews and Karaite Jews. And Karaite Jews are basically just Jews who reject the Talmud. That's fundamentally what the Karaite movement is about. Maimonides talks all about it. And living in the same Jewish community, like in the same cities, and you'd have rabbinic Jews and Karaite Jews. We certainly have that going on. Rabbinic Judaism had one by that point, but you still find Karaites. And certainly after the temple is destroyed, absolutely. Most people are still followers, broadly speaking, of a temple-based Judaism that no longer is possible and no longer exists. It takes a while for people to switch over to a rabbinic Judaism.
So remind me of the definition of the Sadducees and the.
So I'm going to give you real informal definitions here.
That's fine.
Sadducees is the phrase that we're going to use for the people that are the operating status quo of Jewish life during this time period, religious Jewish life during this time period. So it's people who work in the temple and support the temple and support that whole institution. But you're talking about the vast majority of people by saying that. The Pharisees are the proto-rabbis, the proto-rabbinic movement, which has this radical claim that there is this oral Torah that is legitimate as well. That's their radical claim, right? The people at Qumran and the Dead Sea Scrolls have a different radical claim. And the John the Baptist movement, by the way, not a Christian movement. Don't think of it as Christian movement. John the Baptist is totally a Jewish movement. You still find people who believed, Jews, who believed he was the Messiah 400 years later.
So why do the Christians really go after the Pharisees?
So the Christians go after the Pharisees because the early Christians and the early rabbis are fringy people arguing for the same fringy small population of folks. Right, it's like all the sci-fi fans are in a corner and the Star Trek and the Star Wars people are arguing because you can only like one. Star Trek is far superior, just to be clear.
My professor at UCF had also been a proponent of the kind of idea that perhaps Jesus's roots were in the Pharisaical movement as well. It's very hard to tell, obviously, but he had kind of been one of those folks who thought there was maybe more to that relationship as well, with him coming out of that community and then going his own way.
Yeah, I mean, that doesn't seem unreasonable. For instance, one of the things we know about, one of the best sources of information we have about the operations of the synagogue, meaning the Pharisaic movement at the time, is I forget which gospel it is, where Jesus shows up in the synagogue on Shabbat and reads the Haftorah portion. Right? It doesn't call it that. It says he reads from the prophets, but that's what he's doing. He's showing up and he's reading the Haftorah portion for that week. So yeah, certainly whether or not he was at any level officially associated with them, they're certainly deeply in communication. I have a friend from Peoria who's an academic expert in the Jewish practices of the early Jesus movement, like in looking at how they kept kosher, things like that. We'll have him on to talk about it sometime. Yeah.
When you say fringy, say fringy people, are you talking about either priestly or elitist, upper class?
So often elitist and upper class because they had the resources to be involved in a revolutionary movement. But I guess really I'm just talking about not mainstream. You're talking about, I don't know, 10% of the population. I'm making that number up, but some small percentage of the population that is being divided up between all of these different extremist movements. Does that make sense, Paul? And certainly you'd have people who are sympathizers with them along the spectrum into the rest of the 90%, but yeah. Okay, there was a lot more introduction than I was planning on, but this was an interesting conversation. Any other questions on this before we dive into the Talmud itself? Okay, so for the people who are watching on Facebook, just a reminder that if you go to the website, you can jump into the conversation. You can click on the link for Talmud and we will go there. Let's see, where is the Talmud? Okay, so all of that is an introduction to our actual text in brachot, which is nominally talking about prayer. But see, I shared it and then realized there's more to say first, sorry. It's nominally talking about prayer, but what we miss today, I think, is the role that the creation of prayer, because we're talking about the creation of an entire concept. This is not a concept that exists, right? Normative religious observance would have been the murder of an animal in a ritual way, right? There's my vegetarian phrasing right there. But the rabbis transition and say, no, there's this thing you can do where you mumble these words and it's the same thing as this thing that everyone knows is what we're supposed to do to appease the gods. Right, and we miss how radical of an idea it is and how constructed of an idea prayer is, because it is just like a part of the air now, right? Which is sort of a funny word for way of phrasing prayer anyways, I guess. But the rabbis are constructing it, and when they are constructing it, they can't help but run headlong into questions of authenticity and the authenticity of both prayer and of their own project writ large of rabbinic Judaism and rabbinic authority. Does that make sense?
Yeah. After the destruction of the temple, where if you were part of the people who want the same old stuff that they've been doing, did they go to other sites to do the sacrifices or sacrifice? You know, one of the reasons that we were able to make the leap from a temple culture to prayer was the destruction of the temple. So did people fight that by having other sites for a sacrifice, or did they just give up?
So I don't know the answer to that question, but I'm almost certain the answer is yes, there were other locations of cultic practice that would have emerged in response. Almost certain that that's the answer. Would be really surprised if not. But that's a really interesting question. I've got enough friends who are professors of this. I'll reach out and see if we can just have someone join us one day.
Right, because we know we had the sites earlier, and part of the movement with the prophets and with the centralization was a destruction of all these sites and centralizing it in Jerusalem. So it might be logical that it would, become diverse again, diffused.
Yeah, right. And in that sort of thinking, the centralization of religious practice and sacrifice to Jerusalem is really a power move, right?
Right.
And it's an economic move as much as anything else that Josiah does to centralize power into Jerusalem. And so now with sort of a vacuum of Jewish power. Yeah, interesting idea. Okay, so let's actually look at some Talmud, shall we? Let me share the screen. Oh, sorry, you're seeing the back end of the streaming right now. Okay. I remember reading this with everyone. Sorry, I'm going to scroll down until I can't remember reading this. We read that.
I know we discussed the eating of teruma.
Yeah, I was looking to see if we had one of those double S's for a subsection, but I don't see one. I think it's right here. The Gemara discusses the proof offered in the Baraita. Okay, someone want to read for us?
I'll start it off. The Gemara discusses the proof offered in the Baraita. From where do we know that the phrase "and the sun sets" refers to the complete setting of the sun, and therefore "and it is purified" refers to the fact that the day is pure, i.e., and the sun sets and it is purified is one phrasing meaning that the sun will set, the air will clear, and the stars will emerge.
Okay, I think we need to back up just a little bit to make some sense. As it was taught in Baraita regarding the laws of ritual impurity, it is said, one who touches it remains impure until evening. He should not eat of the consecrated item, and he must wash his flesh with water. And the sun sets, and it is purified. Afterwards, he may eat from the truma, for it is his bread. From the passage, and the sun sets, and it is purified, that the absence of the setting of his sun prevents him from partaking of truma. But failure to bring atonement offering does not prevent him from partaking of truma, may be inferred.
Now, in bold text, we have the setting of his sun, which means that's included in the Gemara. And is there a significance to the fact that it's his sun?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I think what's being discussed here, is the distinction between what is actually required and what is not, right? Is it just time bound, meaning the sun, or is there some action that's required also? I think that's where we're going with this, but let's find out. Okay, Toby, will you read that next paragraph that you already read now that we maybe understand
I'll
it?
read it. The Gemara discusses the proof offered in the Baraita. From where do we know that the phrase "and the sun sets" refers to the complete setting of the sun, and therefore "and it is purified" refers to the fact that the day is pure, i.e., "and the sun sets and it is purified" is one phrase, meaning that the sun will set, the air will clear, and the stars will emerge.
Just keep going.
Perhaps the expression "and the sun sets and it is purified" refers to the very beginning of sunset, the setting of the sun's light. According to that explanation, what does the expression "and it is purified" mean? It means that the person will become purified. At the very beginning of sunset, he will go and immerse himself and offer his sacrifice, and only then will he be able to eat his teruma.
Okay, so I can't tell whether we're actually arguing about something else that has relevance, or whether we've fallen into a trap for a moment of just arguing about the meaning of this verse. So I assume we'll find that out in a second. And then if
Well, it's interesting. It isn't just time bound, but this expression, this explanation of it means that he isn't purified unless he immerses also
requires an action as well. Yeah,
and
exactly.
offer a sacrifice. Although up above it said he didn't need his sacrifice, but it also mentioned the immersion. So maybe the immersion is absolutely necessary.
Nice. Okay, let's keep
So are
going.
we all, quick question again.
Yeah.
Are we talking, when you say impure or purity, it's like with this week's Parsha of Tazria, where it's showing how to become pure and cleaning of oneself, different diseases and everything. Is this what this is referring to on it, I guess?
So
With the impurity. So, if you touch a dead carcass on the field, you're impure. So you go back and wait for the day to go and then immerse yourself.
So yes, let's talk a little bit about purity and impurity. It's not the same as cleanliness. We often make that, we often mistake those things. And in fact, often the translators will mistake it. You'll sometimes see it as clean and unclean, right? What we're really talking about is ritual fitness to go onto the Temple Mount, whether you are in a place of ritual fitness or you are not. Does that make sense? It's not about cleanliness as we would understand it, though it does have some relationship. It's maybe a little closer to cleanliness, not to actual germ theory, but to how we sort of get grossed out. Imagine a brand new toilet installed in a brand new bathroom that's never been used and is totally clean, and filling it with soup and eating out of it. Right? Don't you get a little bit of the heebie-jeebies just thinking about it?
That
right?
was a
And the
good
point,
explanation. Yes.
the point being that it's not actually about cleanliness. It's about some other standard of gross versus ungross. And that's what we're dealing with when it comes to purity. As a general rule, the other thing to say about purity is that purity seems to be very much related to the internal fluids of the body becoming external fluids, other than urine and feces. So purity seems to be related to menstruation, to death, to seminal emission, to, I think those are the main ones.
And also to illness, leprosy, that sort of thing.
Yeah, to things that feel a little more public health overtly. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, okay.
No, go ahead.
I was actually, because I was just reading the coming Parsha for this week, which is all about, women and childbirth and, questions of ritual purity. So I've been thinking about this. And I started to ask myself what the purpose of ritual purity is. And it does seem to me that it seeks to redress a certain kind of cultural and spiritual balance. As we go through this, I mean, birth is this dramatic, illness is dramatic, your death, you know, or your coming into contact with anything that's dead. These are all big dramatic occurrences. And there's something there about, I don't know, rebalancing your fitness to be in the presence of God, maybe.
Sure, yeah,
In a
absolutely.
state of grace, you know, like re-achieving a state of grace after something, you know, I mean, we tend to think of childbirth as natural, and yes, in the scheme of things, yes, but it was really a very dangerous process to go through.
Still
And
is.
it's also,
And it still is, yeah.
it's also, there's a little bit of mystery of them not really understanding what's going on. You know, with death, they're uncomfortable, childbirth, menstruation, and, you know, they're not sure how everything fits. So they try and control it by putting boundaries around it in typical Jewish fashion.
Also where the political enters into it too,
Yeah.
because it is about asserting this priestly authority over
Women.
this mystery that they have perhaps nothing specific to do with.
Yep.
Yep.
Okay, let's jump back in. Someone want to read Rabba Bar Rav Shela?
Rabba bar Rav Shela said, if so, that, and it is purified, means that the priest goes and purifies himself, then let the verse say unambiguously, and he will become purified. Since the Torah does not employ that language, the conclusion is, what is the meaning of the expression, and it is purified? It means that the day is pure. No residue of the day remains. As people say colloquially, the sun has set and the day is purified.
Okay, so the answer here to what is purified means is it's an idiom.
Okay.
So Rabba says, we don't know that they're going to agree to that in the end.
Yeah,
Sorry.
it's true.
Okay, next
See the
paragraph.
influence you've had on us, Daniel.
Exactly. Sarah, you want to keep going?
Sure. In the West, I'm not 100%.
Israel.
Is Israel. They
So
did not.
in the West, meaning we're in Israel as opposed to in Babylon. So there
Yes.
are two communities that are dealing with the same Mishnah and developing a Gemara, and they're in communication with each other, but sometimes they have different traditions, and that's what we're picking up here.
Yeah. They did not hear this explanation given by Rabba bar Rav Shila. They raised the dilemma, does the expression "and the sun sets" refer to the actual setting of the sun? And does "it is purified" mean that the day clears away? Or perhaps it refers to the setting of its light at sunset, in which, what is the meaning of "it is purified"? It refers to the purification of a person. In other words, in Eretz Israel, they attempted to clarify the halakha based on the biblical passage, but were unable to do so.
Okay, they struck out. So we don't have to feel bad if we only sort of followed that. They can do that. Okay. Let's keep going. Someone else want to read, or Sarah, you want to keep going?
Does anyone else want to read? If not, I can keep going. Okay. Do you want to read, Renee, or was it just picking up your?
I'll read. Okay. Ultimately, they resolved this dilemma from a baraita. It was taught in a baraita that the time for the recitation of the evening Shema corresponds to the time when priests are permitted to eat of their terumah, a sign for which is the emergence of the stars. Therefore, derive from here that, and the sunsets, refers to the complete sunset, and the expression, and it is purified, means the day clears away, as the sages in Babylonia concluded.
Okay. So we get the end of this section, thankfully, about the purification. But there's a lot here that speaks to our greater meta conversation, which is that, right, ultimately they are determining that the recitation for the evening Shema, meaning this rabbinic invention, right? We think of the Shema as being so old, but this is an invention by the people that are talking right now, is deeply connected to the operations of the temple, down to its timing, that it is the logical and necessary evolution of the operations of the temple, and it even follows the rhythms of the temple. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that before we go on?
Well, that's how they were legitimatizing what they were doing, because was the Shema in existence during temple days?
It seems to be in existence by this time because they refer to it as if it is common knowledge, but not during temple days, probably not.
So then to make it the central prayer, then they have to tie it to the temple.
Exactly. Okay, let's keep going.
In our Mishnah, the master said, the beginning of the time for the recitation of the evening Shema is from the time when the priests enter to partake of their terumah.
Okay, so that's actually goes all the way back to the very beginning of the Talmud, meaning the two pages before this or something.
The Gemara raises a contradiction to this opinion from a Baraita that states that the time for the recitation of the evening Shema is from when a poor person enters to eat his bread with salt until he rises from his meal.
Okay, what do we take from this?
They're going from the elite, which are the priests, and they're taking it down to the common person.
Nice.
So that it has some relevance to someone who is not a priest.
Nice. Okay. Any other thoughts here?
Building on what Toby said, there's a parallel between the priest partaking of the terumah and the poor person eating his bread.
Yeah,
That's kind of bold.
Yeah. Yep. Nice.
What's the significance of the salt?
I think that means that the person's having an actual meal.
Okay.
I think that's the marker there. I think that's what's happening, but I don't know that for sure.
Well,
Okay.
Does a poor person have to be pure to do this, or is it only up to the priest to be pure?
No, now we're in a totally different discussion. Yeah, there's no issues of purity that are being raised here.
That was an excellent question.
Yeah.
yeah.
Interesting.
I'm allowed one question like that a week.
No, because it's so significant, because we're talking about all this purity, and then we have a sentence here that doesn't talk about purity at all.
Yeah, and an important distinction between the two groups of people, right?
Well, don't they talk about? I'm sorry.
No, please.
Don't they later talk about the rules for ritual purity before you can say the Shema?
Yes, and I think we're also going to get the rules of ritual purity before you eat, which may be connected to the solve here too. I'm not sure, but yeah. Okay, let's.
On the notes on the left-hand column at the bottom, we don't see the whole thing, but it starts with the time of the poor person and the time of the priest are one and the same. So they're going to be trying to tie them up together.
Okay, let's read that. You want to read that for us, Toby?
Okay, it's the next paragraph. The Gemara begins its analysis by clarifying whether there is an actual contradiction here or whether different expressions are being employed to describe the same time. The latter clause of the Baraita, which established that the time for the recitation of the evening Shema ends when a poor person rises from his meal, certainly disagrees with our Mishnah. Since the poor person clearly does not continue eating until the end of the third watch, this Baraita certainly contradicts our Mishnah. With regard to the first clause of the Baraita, however, which establishes the beginning of the time for the recitation of the evening Shema, shall we say that it disagrees with our Mishnah?
Okay, right. So what's the question that we're asking here, or that the Talmud's asking? How do we reconcile these two totally different opinions?
Yeah.
Well, one is about a meal, when we start the meal, and the other is when we have to say the Shema, right? Are these different things?
There are different explanations about when the evening Shema may be said, or differently to say when evening begins. And one explanation is tied to when the priests would take their truma, and the other explanation is from when the poor person goes and eats their evening meal until they are done with their meal. So we actually are getting a cap on both sides in this example, which is what we're about to dive into.
So in the broadening of this sense of the place of the Shema, from it being a sort of elite priestly incantation with real specific rules regarding when it should be eaten, all of a sudden it becomes this society-wide every man's prayer that is part of an everyday experience.
So that's a great read here, Renee. I've never thought of it with this section. Yeah, that's a fundamental difference between these two examples. It also reflects a change in what Judaism looked like, from being something done by an elite caste to something. Yeah, nice, beautiful.
In fact, this paragraph that we just read just kind of blew my mind.
Yeah.
Because it's almost like the Declaration of Independence or something. You know, this is something that people can do for themselves.
Bobby.
Wow.
Hey,
But you know what?
And
They keep mentioning it being a Baraita. And, you know,
Okay.
it's not really part of the Torah. And so I don't think anybody really wants to take, I don't want to use the word credit, but authorship of this.
Okay.
Yeah, nice. We're also dealing
Well,
with
it's really radical. It's radical.
radical. Oh, I love your read there, Renee. Thank you.
Renee, and we've taken it even further because there are some theologians who teach that every generation has to take the Shema and redefine it for the life that within Judaism and redefine Judaism for every generation. So the Shema is something that we teach the kids that has to make sense to them in the present time. So you just really nailed that.
Okay, let's keep going.
Who's reading?
Whoever wants to.
where are you?
Take it, Paul.
The Gemara
Okay,
rejects.
the Gemara immediately rejects this idea. No, the time when the poor person eats and the time when the priest is purified and permitted to partake of his teruma are one and the same.
Okay, right. So this answer here, this way of dealing with it is say, no, same thing. Two ways of saying the same thing. 6 of one, half a dozen of the other.
Kind of answered my question. The Gemara raises a contradiction from the Tosefta. From when does one begin to recite Shema in the evening?
Okay, just a note. Baraitas are verses from the Mishnah that don't make the cut.
Mm.
And the Tosefta is a collection of Baraitas.
Ah,
Oh.
It's the Mishnah's step something. I don't know.
So the
Okay.
Tosafata is related or written by the Tosafot? Aren't those the people who, from
You'd think so,
after
but no.
Rashi?
No, yeah. No, totally different group. The Tosafists are unrelated to the Tosefta.
Okay.
Yep. Okay, keep going, Paul.
From the time when people enter to eat their bread on Shabbat Eve, this is the statement of Rabbi Meir. As they do in our Mishnah, the rabbis say, from the time when the priests are eligible to partake of their teruma, a sign for which is the emergence of the stars. And although there is no explicit proof that the emergence of the stars is when one may begin to recite the evening Shema, there is an allusion in the book of Nehemiah to the fact that the emergence of the stars is generally considered the beginning of the night.
mhm.
As it is stated with regard to the building of the walls of Jerusalem. And we perform the work, and half of them grasp their spears from dawn until the emergence of the stars. And it says that in the night they may be a guard to us and may labor in the day. From here we ascertain that the day ends with the emergence of the stars.
Yeah.
Okay. Did we follow that logic? Anyone want to explain that quickly?
So I was always taught.
That it begins with the emergence of the stars. And here someone is asking, like, where do you get that from? And they don't actually have a very good textual reference here, right? Like, I feel like anytime you got to resort to Nehemiah anyways, you're dealing with sort of rough references. Right? Like, I can't name anything from Nehemiah. I don't know. Yeah, and it doesn't quite fit. So again, I think they're going to start poking holes at that in a moment. But I do want to point out the beginning of this, that from when does one begin to recite Shema in the evening? From when people enter to eat their bread on Shabbat Eve. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir. That's the Rabbi Meir that we kept hearing of so much about in the last story that we looked at with the Pardes, right? He's the teacher, or excuse me, the student of Elisha.
Mhm.
So anytime, this is one of those that they don't know who said it, so they say it was his.
No,
Right.
here they overtly are putting it in his mouth. No, there's that custom that when you don't know it's him. But here, no, they're saying explicitly that this was Rabbi Meir.
Oh, okay.
Okay, let's keep going.
Even before analyzing these sources, the Gemara seeks to clarify a confusing element in the Tosafot.
Tosefta.
Tosefa. In their biblical proof, the rabbis do not suffice with one verse, but rather they say, and it says, and they cite in an additional verse. What is added by this use of, and it says? It seems superfluous as the entire proof appears in the first verse.
Okay, right? Like, I love that the very first thing that they're dealing with is, why did you have two proof texts? Right? We're not dealing with the substance at all. Just, why did you have two proof texts? And so we're going to address that.
The Gemara answers that the first verse was not sufficient, as if you say that night begins when the sun sets, but the workers stayed late and arrived early, i.e., due to the importance of their task, they worked even into the night. In anticipation of this objection, the second verse was cited to teach, come and hear, as it is stated, that in the night they may be a guard to us, and they may labor in the day. The time between dawn and the emergence of the stars is explicitly referred to as day, proving that night begins with the emergence of the stars.
Okay.
That seems to buttress Nehemiah,
Yeah,
but there's something common, eh?
I'm sure. You want to read, Bobby?
We're
Right at the top. Yep.
and analyzing the three opinions. Is that
Yeah.
where we're starting? And
Yep.
analyzing the three opinions regarding the beginning of the period for the recitation of the evening Shema, the Gemara begins with the supposition. It might enter your mind to say that the time when the poor person typically eats his meal and the time when ordinary people eat their Shabbat evening meal are one and the same time, since in both cases, those eating would seek to begin their meals as early as possible, as, for different reasons, they are unable to kindle additional lights to illuminate their meal. And if you say that the time of the poor person's meal and the time when the priest is purified and permitted to partake of this teruma are one and the same time, then the opinion of the rabbis is identical to that of Rabbi Meir. What is their disagreement? My first thought when I read this is they're making a differentiation between a poor person and ordinary person. That's what struck me out of this thing. I mean, what in the world are they thinking?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, are poor people extraordinary as opposed
That's-
to ordinary?
That's
Well,
the
actually,
question.
what I'm seeing here, you got three castes of people. You've got your poor, ordinary, and the priests. But to me, they're all
I always
go to break
discount the
bread.
priests.
Okay, but they talked about it in this paragraph.
Yeah, but they
So
don't exist.
that's why you had the three castes. But okay,
So what's your
I
take,
wonder if there's
Danny?
some sort of meal service. I wonder if there's some sort of
If
meal
there's-
service, a soup kitchen or something. No, I mean it. Like I wonder if that's
Well, I thought one of the things they're saying they would both seek to begin their meals as early as possible for different reasons, because the poor people don't have enough candles to keep it lit, so they could see what they're eating, and then ordinary people want to eat early enough so that the stars aren't out yet. I don't know.
Because
That's
it's typically their Shabbat evening meal, so they can't kindle lights for Shabbat.
Right.
Yeah.
They have
Ah.
to wait for those 3 stars to peek out.
the next day.
But
Yeah.
that is why that they're mentioning Shabbat rather than an ordinary day.
Yes.
Because on Shabbat, until it's dark, you can't kindle any lights. Where during the regular week, you can kindle those lights whenever you want. So when you start to eat, so there could be a
No.
time differential on when you would consider evening or Shema time in the week and when it would be on Shabbat.
Danny, I might have jumped the gun. The next paragraph seems to elucidate some of this.
So let's hear it, Bobby. Read it for us.
Rather, what we said previously must be rejected, and instead learn from this that there is a separate time for the poor person and a separate time for the priest. However, this conclusion is based on the assumption that the time of the poor person and the time of the people are the same. That too can be rejected with the assertion that no, the time of the poor person and the priest are one and the same time, and the time of the poor person and people are not the same. Accordingly, the opinion expressed by the Tana in our Baraita is identical to that of the other Tanaim, and only Rabbi Meir disagrees with them. And is the time of the poor person and the priest the same? Interesting. I'm more confused than ever.
So it helps to understand that the discussion that's happening is not about the Shema, and it's not about the poor person and the priest and the common people. The discussion that's happening is how do we make it so that a seeming disagreement between the sages is not actually a disagreement? That's
Huh.
the conversation that's actually happening here.
Ah,
And so
okay.
they are engaged in a project right here of trying to come up with a theoretical scenario that will eliminate the differences between people who they don't want to be disagreeing.
So it's taking a square table and making it a circle. I got it.
Exactly. Okay. Until next week.
Thank
Whoa.
you. Victory.
Oh, wait. Before everybody signs off, did everybody
you.
wish Tony a happy birthday? It was her birthday yesterday.
Yeah.